All right, so welcome to today's Brussels Press Club conference on Ukraine and EU energy policy. My name is Kenneth Raposa. I'm a writer for Forbes. And to my left, I have Alan Riley and a member of European Parliament from Poland, I believe. Right? Yep. I'm looking at the flag and I got that right. And I will not even try to pronounce the name. Jacek Surowski. How's that? B minus? B minus? B minus. All right. All right. Not bad. Not bad. Okay. So we got 40 minutes. I'm going to start asking these guys some questions. And do you guys want this to be on? We got journalists here. So you want this to be on the record or off the record? How do you want them to deal with you?
On the record is fine by me.
On the record is fine for Alan. On the record for both of them. So there you go.
Great, send the signal to Moscow.
Yep. So there you go. They're on the record. I'm the moderator, so I am off the record. And I'm a journalist like you, so you don't need to quote me. All right, so here we go. I'll ask this first question to the member of parliament over there from Poland. And my question was on energy policy and the sanctions on Russia. And what I wanted to get a sense of was, it seemed like the EU was really quick to follow in Washington's footsteps on this policy of sanctioning Russian oil and gas. And I was wondering, where did this directive come from? Was this something that the EU followed Washington's lead, or was this something that churned inside of the European Commission and was something that high-level European commissioners said, this was a good idea, we should do this? So I would like to start with you, Mr. Volsky.
Does it? Yes. Well, first of all, we did not follow America because we should have followed our own policy since the first gas tap was closed by Russia in 2006. So it's our own fault to be so late and so wrong. America was at the beginning of Biden also mistaken, allowing Nord Stream to continue, as you may remember. So the energy policy of the Union is mistaken, faulty, and it shows the same misguided aspects as Russia policy. It's based on the false assumptions of geopolitical project of Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok, and it shares the same neglect of security aspect in Europe. And it has been already signaled by Central East Europeans, because the title is Central East European Perspective, if I am not, the view from Eastern Europe. We're not Eastern Europe, we are Central Europe. And today Biden is meeting the Bucharest 4 Central Europe, 9 Eastern flank states. Eastern Europe is further away until Ural, to stick to the Gaulle definition. Anyway, so first we warned in 2006 when the tap was closed by Russia to Ukraine, and then allow me my lack of modesty, I produced a European Parliament report in 2007 saying that energy security is a matter of foreign and security policy and not energy policy. And it was, again, sorry for lack of modesty, it was prophetic. Everything we said then, and it was my voice in the parliament, but it was conviction of many others in our part of Europe, that energy is a weapon and should be treated as such. And if we are today in war with Ukraine, it's because this voice was not listened to. So what I'm trying to say that both mistaken, faulty Russia policy of EU and mistaken and faulty energy policy of EU is victim of the same dominant, until today, even faulty approach, which is Franco-German one, dominated by German narrow economic interests and greed, by its faulty Russophilia, and by French geopolitical faulty dreams of this Lisbon-Vladivostok together with Russia and away from US policy. So it's an old story. We were not listened to. We have a war, which is a result of. And today we are still not listened to. if today Ukraine is in danger of losing the war because of the delayed deliveries of arms and ammunition, it's because of the same thinking, because Western European leaders were saying, you were right, we should have listened to you, but now they still don't listen. We should have delivered all those things much earlier. And when Zelensky was in Washington, Biden at the press conference, he said that he cannot deliver ATSMS and tanks at that time and fighter jets because that would split or divide NATO. It was a hidden admission that it is France and Germany who are blocking it. And today you hear in Munich all those beautiful words by Scholz and Macron, but all that's too little too late, covering that it was a sabotage of the proper, as it should be, Russia policy and energy policy. And the war is a price. Well, looking into who is guilty will not bring us far ahead, but the second faulty line is that security in the perspective from Central Eastern Europe is above and primordial as related to energy policy, climate, all that stuff. We think that first security, then climate and others, because if we are dead, it's all this. I mean, the level of CO2 for us is rather not important very much. So we were against excluding, or to say the least, energy security approach from both energy and Russia policy. And the strange thing happening is that although late and too little, but Russia policy is evolving. Energy policy is stagnant. There's nothing. Mr. Timmermans is happy continuing this. France, Germany saying no to nuclear. This green madness of EU policy, climate policy continues as if nothing has happened. Because if those two policies, Russia policy and energy policy, share the same false assumptions and faults, the revision should concern both. And there's no revision or even political will or mention of. Whoever proposes to revise it, to take that into account in order to secure first security and then other noble goals, is outvoted massively by the mainstream of Western Europe and center left and center right in the European Parliament, where I am coming from and where I am paradoxically the standing rapporteur for energy security, saying things to the deaf ears. We should change this policy by making our energy mix first, putting it at service of the security, full stop, and then whatever remains we may take into account all other right or wrong, ideologically biased or not, environmental, energy, climate policy. So this line of neglecting this necessary change is harmful. In the past, one could quote a lot of harmful wrongdoings by European Commission, for example, and Professor Riley, we can go into details. There's an amicable settlement of Gazprom abuse of competition law of EU, for example. Where should we go? I think we should go to everything which makes us independent and secure from any other further blackmail or chantage or dependency on Russia, zero dependency policy. And conclusions should be drawn for the energy mix, including, for some it will be horrific, going back to coal, not only gas, but from other sources, and for sure the clean energy from nuclear, which for the moment Germany blindly refuses to. So security first, and changes in energy policy of the Union are necessary for years to come. And this dream of Europe saving the planet, which is something. I mean, if I was a Russian geopolitical strategist, I would exactly advise Europe to do that. And I think that some of the script was written in Moscow. And if we today concentrate on who was bribed by whom, I think that at least half of the green lobby in the European Union was motivated by Russian influence, if not money. And we should take that into account as much as we deal with small fish from Qatar. We should attack and face the big fish from Russia in terms of strategic corruption of our political elite and overall security policy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Volsky. So let me ask Antonia over there. So I see her on screen. I don't want her to think that I forgot that she's there. So let me ask her, Antonia, who realistically will replace Russia for natural gas? Let's say for natural gas imports, I think into Germany were 35% Russian, for example. So who replaces Russian oil and gas, and even to some extent coal? I know Poland's been replacing some coal in that regard, but who replaces Russia realistically for Europe?
Well, that is a very important question. It is basically the EU security goal not to necessarily become independent, which is something that I believe we cannot fully do as much as I would like to, but become less dependent on vulnerable sources. And here's what we have seen during 2022. We have seen Norway growing its supplies towards Europeans. We have seen deals with Qatar, and most recently, we have seen deals with Azerbaijan, which are obviously, from a political standpoint, also rather vulnerable sources. I mean, considering that the Azeri sources is not necessarily very far away from the Russian source, we have to think about ways to increase production on our own. And this is where we need to think both infrastructure, which is something that we have thought through, because obviously increasing LNG consumption and basically getting LNG supplies instead of natural gas, we have had to think about infrastructure and new infrastructure, which obviously was an urgent thing to do. But I believe that the EU should at least think about alternatives that come from the EU proper. I'm thinking about reserves that have not yet come online from Romania, for instance, from the Black Sea. I'm also thinking about increase of nuclear, which was already mentioned, and obviously thinking about investment in looking how to make coal as clean as possible if our goal is to go green. Now, the problem with renewable energy was that we didn't really invest much, and we did not really make renewables an alternative. So as much as we would love to see Europe save the world, as the other speaker said, we cannot really save ourselves with just renewables. And obviously, we are looking at least during the next 3 to 5 years, at an emergency plan where we will need to figure out not only alternative sources, but also figure out our own policy with regards to what we consume. There have been hydro projects that were let down because of our obsession with having everything greener. And hydro is green in theory, but the technology that goes along with hydro, some of the technology, the older stuff, is not necessarily as green as the European Commission would like to see it green. So I believe that we need to do a lot of twisting of what we thought would work in terms of green and renewables going forward, and a lot of creative and kind of support policy for getting our own energy online and getting our own production online to support our industrial needs, because we are already restructuring our production needs, considering LNG is replacing natural gas. I don't want to think about, ways to restructure our industrial needs going from renewables, because that is going to be a lot expensive, and I'm not sure how efficient that would be.
Right. And I think there are some companies actually that either temporarily closed factories recently because of the price of electricity as well. Alan, this is a question for you. He's an energy expert, so you can check his bio. He's a pretty smart man. Alan, question for you. This is on Europe and renewable energy in general, where it seems a lot of this comes from Brussels, maybe comes from London to some degree, but a lot of it comes from Brussels and Berlin, is my sense, and from the United States. That's where a lot of the renewable energy policy comes from. That's where the story comes from. That's where the push comes from. Are there any other countries in the EU that everybody on board with this? Is Portugal on board? Is Italy on board? Is Greece on board? Is everybody on the same team when it comes to this push for renewable energy in the EU?
I think what you've got to always say is that the Union is a very diverse set of states with not just diverse political cultures, but actually, diverse geography and geology. So aside, before we get into the politics of this, is that one of the difficulties with Union energy policy, when it comes in terms of the production of energy or the use of energy, is that creating a uniform structure is actually quite difficult when things are very different. You can potentially, in theory, use quite a lot of wind for the states around the North Sea. Solar in Belgium, well, tricky. So there's a whole simple issue with that. But what I think is certainly, I think you're true, is that there was a driver. If you go right back, I think it's the Hampton Court summit in 2005, which really was the initial driver of this, and that was the UK and Germany. And what's really interesting is, even to state, whether just leaving Brexit aside, is the Brits actually have been much more, how can I put it, effective at cutting CO2 emissions than Germany, despite the German sort of talk about the energy change which they are trying to undertake. But obviously there's a real difference in terms of, this is one of the other issues, the whole renewables strategy is that in many ways it's a thing of rich countries. It's designed in rich countries, which rich countries can relatively easily afford. Because you've got not just the cost of the wind power structures, because of course it's not the wind power itself, in theory is cheaper, but you've got to build not just the windmills, but also the infrastructure. You've got to deal with intermittency, whatever. These become very expensive. So if you are from rich countries, it's easier to afford. Because you've got to basically think about it in terms of intermittency, that when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, you need backup. So you need two systems. If you need two systems, that you see the exponential increase in costs. So there's also a rich-poor divide in Europe in relation to this, and of course more broadly globally. This is one of the issues with energy supply. So I am, that's before we get into the politics. So this is, you can argue that the funds provided by the Commission post-COVID make it easier, at least financially, to undertake a lot.
Which program is that? Re-energy EU, something like that?
There is, well, essentially, I think when you talk about it is there's a series now of different EU funds which have been put in place post-COVID to rebuild the European economy, or to build back better, as they say. How far this actually will do that is open to question. Because one of the worries I have about this strategy is that if we get it wrong, you could end up with an actually inferior power generation system, which ends up costing more energy and actually renders Europe less competitive than it is now. So, of course, a lot of the conversation about Europe's energy is that, through our reform and through the renewables, we will end up with a much more efficient and capable energy system. If it's actually more expensive and it needs enormous amounts of backup, which itself is expensive to sustain, then we won't have a cheap and plentiful power. And the history really of successful economies is their access to cheap and plentiful power. And of course, one of the things is that if you're going into a world of more electrification, more digitalization, you're talking about access to more power, not less.
One of the things that you guys talked about was dependence on Russia, for example. So of course, we're talking about renewables. And I know in the United States, solar is a big Chinese enterprise. It's pretty much responsible for almost 80% of the solar in the United States is manufactured in China. My thinking is it's even higher than that in the EU. I'm not sure, but Mr. Volsky, what do you think about that? I mean, in terms of renewable energy, I mean, what European companies other than wind turbines, which I'm sure a lot of them are in the Netherlands and I think maybe even in Germany, big players in that space. But who is there a solar industry in Europe that can churn out solar and that can become part of the renewable base? Does that even exist? Does somebody make solar cells and solar panels in the United States? I mean, in Europe, to speak of, that can possibly be, an independent source of renewable energy?
Well, the answer is no, because we have outsourced everything, also the pharmaceutical to the Chinese. So we should rebuild our own industrial base. But adding to the question that was raised by the previous, by the Madame Antona Golbasanu, we have a huge assets of gas in Netherlands, which Netherlands says no, will not allow to, which could replace Russian ones.
Why? Why do they say no? Like, what's the reason for it?
Ask Prime Minister Rutte and Dutch, because they want first they are falsely green. I mean, they are green to the bone. That's my suspicion. Or they're so egoistic that they keep it for future, for themselves, which wouldn't surprise me. So first, there's an area or there's a space to shift in terms of energy mix to sources which are our own, including, as I said, coal, but also gas of our own, to be totally, I mean, to bring down to zero deliveries from Russia. Then there's a huge potential for nuclear. Imagine that this gigantic consumer of energy, which is German industry, turns into clean nuclear energy. If they forget this obsession, I don't know how to call it, misguided anti-nuclear policies, not understandable, not explainable. So on our own, this first answer in various areas where we should widen the energy mix, and there is obviously our neighborhood, Africa in terms of solar, as we know. There's energy from oceans, which is not yet discovered or exploited.
You're talking deep sea oil, maybe?
Sorry?
Deep sea oil and gas, is that what you're talking about there in terms of ocean?
But also the movement of water, the waves are a source of energy. Well, I'm not a scientist in energy sources, but somewhere I read how small portion of Sahara could cover all our needs if properly used for solar. But I don't want to go into details because some say that it's so costly to eliminate the desert dust from that it does not face the economic criteria. It's not efficient. But anyway, there are possibilities if there is a will. And there are possibilities if there is no sacrosanct cows. How do you say it?
Sacred cows. Yep.
Yeah, like no energy because coal. No, even if we have the pure technology for coal, carbon capture and storage, which is for the moment forgotten and put aside. I mean, there's plentiful of solutions if there is a will, but the will is to go straight to something which is a trap, which was so eloquently described by Professor Riley, that will build something which will be not sustainable. I mean, the paradox is that this word sustainable applies to the description of the situation. We are built in the name of sustainable green economy, we are building non-sustainable economy because of this backup needed, because of the cost element, because of the competitiveness and so forth. And then geopolitical argument. I mean, whatever we do with our European 7% of emissions of CO2, with China and India every year building new coal power stations and so forth, it is a joke what we are doing. We are committing a suicide, a harakiri, in the name of some ideological obsession without any impact on the climate. If the theory of anthropogenic nature of global warming is correct, which is not 100% sure. Thanks.
Yeah, it's almost as if India and China exist on another planet. You don't burn anything here, but burn it there and it's fine. It floats in a separate solar system, apparently. So I have a question for Antonia. Antonia, on a geopolitical side, so when you think of energy costs going up in Europe, Europe makes things, you know, they still make Mercedes-Benzes in Europe, as far as I know. They still make wind turbines and big engines at Siemens and so on. So it's a big industrial power still. But as you know, electric prices are going up. So when you look at the geopolitical risk of just the sense of uncertainty of energy supply and just all of the energy supply risk in general, what does that mean when you look at the everyday life of Europeans who have to make a living and heat their home and power their businesses? I mean, how do you translate that to the, you know, the average person? You know, what does that mean to them?
Well, basically, there is a big gap between classes that is going to grow even higher. So what Professor Riley said about the way that countries, you know, the developed countries achieve better levels of whatever you would need for getting greener, it is also true for the social classes in Europe. And this polarization that has started before the pandemic has deepened during the pandemic, is basically growing higher because of the energy crisis and because of the inflation that we have all kind of consistently have had in Europe starting 2021, actually. So basically, we are not yet talking, as you well said, we are not yet talking about full restructuring of the industries. That is basically starting because of the cost increased. Now, this obviously raises the question of what do states do to protect their citizens? And in 2022, we have seen an increase in subsidies and in support schemes for households and for small businesses, which obviously is a cost that nation state needs to provide, right? It is a cost that is costing the nation state in what means, you know, this so-called sustainability of finances on the long term. But obviously, it is an emergency that needs to be done, considering that we are all dealing with the war. However, this is not done in the same way everywhere. So there is not a European Union level kind of response to what happens with the national economies, with the EU economy overall. And that poses the question of what are we doing to actually support the current restructuring that we are under and that is accelerated by the war in Ukraine. And obviously that is not necessarily getting better, considering that the war is going on right now and we are looking at what happens next winter. We did not have a very bad winter this winter because of the weather. We did not have many problems that we expected to have because we could deal with what happened. And we have gas storage is high enough to deal with what happens. But going forward, if the polarization is putting pressure on national governments, if populism is growing again, if nationalism is growing again, and if the European Union states are not coming together to tackle this crisis as they should have from the very beginning, as a common crisis, because we are all affected by it. We are not, affected in the same way, but we are all affected by it. We are likely going to see a structural crisis that affects the politics of the European Union. And that might go into a direction that I don't believe that even the developed countries that have many resources or have put many resources on the table to go green will actually be able to deal with, considering the whole industrial restructuring.
Great, thank you, Antonio. I think we have maybe 5 minutes left, so I'll ask one more question. This is for Alan, then Mr. Bolsky. Is we talked about this before? Is I'm not convinced that this idea of the whole renewable energy stuff and the whole sanctioning of Russia, I'm not convinced that it's just entirely a European Union government idea. I think that there's outside influencers that are very important in this entire policy and in making these decisions. So, Alan, who are some of the big influencers that are like non-governmental who are coming in here and advising on this path that Europe is hellbound to take right now?
What I think you'd look at is obviously there's large numbers of different NGOs with different mixture of ideological and obviously sometimes incredibly sort of innocent sort of basis on which they're operating, concerned about the climate and so on, which is entirely legitimate. Of course, you also go out and, as Jessica Sarowski said, is that there is this huge problem with also the, if you like, how can I put it, the less legitimate influences which have been around for a very long time and still operate across the European quarter, who are working with Moscow or with Beijing or both, and that is an issue, and it remains a major security issue. And there is a kind of, I think it's getting changing, I think, because of the war, but there's still a tremendous innocence in the European quarter across the Brussels bubble about the scale of such operations.
Mr. Bolsky, would you agree? Would you agree with that? In other words, is this coming? Is this a European government decision? Is this a European government path, pure and simple, or is this outside?
As I said before, my estimate is that half of this green policy is due to the foreign influence financing. I don't know the facts and I cannot quote sources, but over years I've seen so many proofs and elements of information saying that Greens are paid by Russia. Green NGOs are paid by Russia straight or financed by Russia in Germany and elsewhere. So for us, it is so obvious that it is not a question. It's a fact that this green policy, half is because of some novel idealistic convictions, which are respectable, which does not mean that justifiable, and half is foreign influence. And to those who are idealistic, if they would say, we went into this dependency on Russia, which produced a war because we wanted a cleaner planet, or I would indicate there is a paradox. How much CO2 emissions were produced by the war, Russian war against Ukraine, and huge industry, burning cities in Ukraine, emissions of the war, nobody calculated, and war industry, which is beginning at full speed now. And can we separate this geopolitical security aspect from this green CO2 aspect? We can't, because perhaps what we could have theoretically gained in terms of CO2 emissions by this high but criminal, as we see, dependency on Russia was already outpassed by by the war, CO2 from war, but nobody speaks of, nobody calculates. It's calculable. One can say, my feeling is that we are producing much more CO2 because of this deprived of imagination, blindness to reduce CO2, irrespective of geopolitics and security. Thanks.
Yes, I think I read once that the military industrial complex of the United States produces more CO2 than, many major industries. One last question, one last comment, Antonio, you got a minute. Any thoughts on that, on outside influencers, and not necessarily the Russian government, but any other groups, whether it's an investment bank, private equity, or NGOs, as we were talking about earlier. Do you know any of those, and what are your thoughts on that? Wrap it up in a minute.
I'll start by saying that there is no EU government, that as far as I know, we have EU member states that have been influenced to come together on policies. And obviously, with the help of the Commission, we reached this idea that we are going to save the world through the green energy. Now, to say, yes, of course, there is an interest that Russia and China support their own economic, ideas with regards to Europe. We know that Russia has a strategy towards Europe, but obviously there are also those that are actually believing that we need to go greener because of the climate change, because of the way that we need to live our life, and so on. So there is influence, and this we have to deal with at the national states level, I believe, first. And there are also those that are believers into the green policy. It has become a sort of a religion for some part of the society. And obviously, we can debate whether that is naturally a natural process, or whether that was also influenced by outside actors. But fact is, we have that as well.
Thanks very much. Oh, are we taking questions? One question, apparently. Go ahead.
Finally, you said that the UK was more effective at cutting CO2 emissions than Germany.
Yeah.
Well, in the period 1990 to 2010, if you took into account imports, the UK cut no emissions, and you can make the same comment about Germany. So, yeah, fair enough. Okay, but it's I'm sorry. Look, the reports have been made on this. The UK didn't cut its emissions if you include imports. So that's one comment. Now, the other comments relate to Mr. Saryusz-Wolski and his comments. So in the case of the Netherlands, as you know, Groningen, they're closing the gas field in Groningen, but they're closing it because of earthquakes and subsidence. That's the reality for why the Dutch, at least in that area, are cutting gas. And in the case of nuclear, perhaps you can remind me how well Flamanville is doing. It was started in 2007. The French are still working on it. It is a French farce, and it's still not commissioned. How many years has that taken to build, to be built? And then there was a question on PV, and your claim, apparently Europe outsources everything. Well, there are companies that make PV panels in Europe. One of them is called Meyer Burger, and they make panels both in Freiburg and in the USA, and they have about 4 gigs of factory. But the reason that the Chinese are dominant, and this is a question for you as a politician, is because the Chinese central bank funded PV construction factories in China around about 2010. And the interesting question is, why didn't the European Central Bank or the EIB fund factories in Europe? Because most of the equipment for those factories came from Europe, and that's a fact. And you and your colleagues could have had influence over the ECB to have the factories built here. But everybody seemed happy to have them built with cheap money from the European Central Bank, from the Chinese Central Bank in China. But we could have had them built here. So those are the points that I'm making.
Can I just come back? I think that you raised a vast number of things which I can't deal with in one go. But basically, just to take you on the thing, it is clear that I was working on I was just giving you the in terms of the actual cutting of CO2 emissions by the UK and Germany. And on that basis, what I said was correct. It is absolutely correct also that if you take account of consumption, i.e., and this is actually part of the whole problem with our climate change approach in Europe and the UK, is that if you say you've got to look at, there's only one climate, there's only one stack of CO2 emissions by humanity, and as a consequence of which you should actually not look at production of CO2 emissions, but at consumption. But as I am operating in an EU framework and I'm critiquing that, that was what I was focusing on, that particular point. I cannot put a footnote in everything single thing I say. I'm quite clear. I've made that point before. I've made that point in print, but clearly I was dealing with it in the EU framework. That is clear. On a lot of the other stuff you're talking about in terms of China, what I would say about China is this, that I do not think the solution is that the European Central Bank should fund vast amounts of solar. The real issue is that what the Chinese Central Bank was doing, and the Chinese state banks, virtually all of the banks in China are state banks, and their funding is controlled and directed by the Chinese Communist Party. The real question that we should have asked is, why on earth are we treating China as operating as a normally commercial player? And that is an issue. It's like buying. I'll give you another example. If you take of ChemChina Syngenta, which was a merger between ChemChina, which was a ragbag bunch of Chinese chemical companies, and Syngenta, which was a European life science champion. There is no way that deal should have happened. Apart from anything else, it was not a commercial transaction. ChemChina had $40 billion of debt on its books, but it could borrow $40 billion more to buy Syngenta. That was not a commercial transaction. And yet it went through. It sailed through the merger control system in Brussels. It sailed through the merger control system in Washington. And yet it was not a commercial transaction. So what actually, I think, I can see what you're saying, but I think the big point I take from it is actually there's this been blindness. And in this poem by W.H. Auden, September 1939, sitting in a dive in New York, it talks about the 1930s being a low, dishonest decade. Well, perhaps the period we've been through, perhaps not low and dishonest, but low, muddled and unimagining of what the real situation of the world we're living in. And I think that is what's happened for the West, principally the EU, but also the US.
Great. Let's wrap this up because time is running out. We've got another panel. If you guys have questions for the panelists, you can speak to them in the 15-minute break we have. Okay, thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope we're all now suitably refreshed and ready for a second panel. So the overall theme of this panel is US and German perspectives on EU energy policy. Now, I'm not going to go into the biographical details, but what I'm going to do actually really is to just start off the conversation, I think, with Ken, and ask him to take us through his initial observations from a US perspective.
Oh, sure. So I won't criticize too much because I'm not in my own house. I got to be nice to the Europeans. Europe is very important to the United States because actually some of our most important states in the United States really copy the US. California and New York, for example, very powerful, important politically in the United States. So if Europe does something, right, it's always seen as great. It's always seen as a good thing, right? The Europeans do it, so why shouldn't we do it? And this usually starts in California and New York. And if California and New York copy what Europe does, then what happens is it kind of bleeds out through there. Other states and cities will copy. So Europe is very important to the United States from a policy perspective because anything Europe does in those two states, California and New York, they're going to see as right. And so if California and New York adopt it because Europe adopted it, then it just bleeds out to the rest. And so if Europe does something stupid, California does something stupid, and then New York does something stupid, and the rest of us do something stupid. It always comes back to Europe. So now, for example, I think Europeans, for example, are talking about banning cars in some cities, right? So California is talking about banning gas cars in a I don't know when they're going to do this and what year's time they plan on doing this. But this is something that starts from Europe and it spreads out, and so from a U.S. perspective, European energy policy is important in that regard, right? That's more the man on the street. And on the other side, I would say, like on the strategy side, right? A lot of the people in the United States, probably Washington, they're probably looking at this too and salivating in a lot of ways
Mhm.
because they see, oh, good, energy prices going to be more expensive in Europe. I can entice these pharmaceutical companies to come here because it's cheaper. Electricity is cheaper. I can entice so-and-so BMW to manufacture over here because it's cheaper. You don't have the same electricity costs, right?
Mhm.
Because we're not doing the same. We are pushing for renewables. We are, but I think we're even better than United States, than Europe on this. Even on in the case of solar, which we have subsidies for American-made solar now, which is growing in an attack against China. So, I think the United States in that regard, I don't like it as an individual because we don't want to copy some of the bad policies in Europe because it extends out from California, New York, spreads out to the country like a virus. We want Europe to do well. We don't want Europe to do anything that makes our key states copy. And the other side, a lot of people in Washington just look at this and say, if Europe wants to shoot itself in the foot and make electricity prices go through the roof, we'll offer their manufacturers a place to make things here in the United States. So I think in that regard, they're also quite happy about that.
Well, that's a kind of, how can I put it, reassuring view, which should, to a degree, perhaps alarm European policymakers. So, Vlad, can I actually come to you next? And you've got a completely different view, an interesting multi-state view of our energy policy. I just perhaps, I've read a lot of your stuff. It's so fantastic. I'm really interested into what you have to say. So the floor is yours.
Yeah. I come from a macroeconomic perspective, and I look at energy and the energy transition in terms of, okay, what are we actually doing? What's the purpose of the energy we use, and how do we produce the energy as efficiently as we can? People talk about energy efficiency all the time. But what do you think about energy efficiency? You think, okay, I'm going to change this bulb to a more efficient bulb. My diesel-powered car is going to, use 1 liter less diesel. But who thinks about the efficiency of producing energy? It actually takes energy to produce energy. It's called EROI, energy return of investment. And the energy efficiency in producing energy is actually the most important and key element in our macroeconomic development of the world. 200 years ago, we spent 80% of our lives, 80% of our energy to survive and to keep us warm. We were doing nothing but feeding ourselves and keeping us warm, 80% of our time. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution, we could reduce it to 10% of our time. 90% of our time, we could build railway cars and we could play soccer. Now, what we're doing now, by going into wind and solar, an intermittent source of energy, we're actually reducing our energy efficiency at such a dramatic level that we are running short of energy. And that's a key aspect which has not been understood, even in the scientific community, is not much discussed. We've written a paper on this, on energy return on investment, but it's so important to think of, okay, how do we sustain ourselves as best as we can? How do we become better in doing what we need? We need more energy in the future. We need much more energy in the future. Not a little bit more, much more. All the net zero targets you see, they're talking about a reduction of global consumption of energy. I am very sorry, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen, right? I mean, we're talking about Europe or the US play not zero, but very little role in the world. The key is Asia, perhaps in Asia and Africa. And we have to become efficient, not inefficient. And that's, I think, one key element in this whole discussion. Now, of course, energy policy is, and I think Jacek, you made a very good point, energy security, energy affordability, and then there's environmental protection. Okay, those three things. Environmental protection, what is that? It appears to be only CO2 today, doesn't it? But there's a little bit more to the environment, I think, right? There's land use, there's recycling issues, there's other emissions, right? There is all these efficiency issues, all those things. But, today's energy policy has completely focused on one point at the expense of all the others. And what does it mean that energy becomes more expensive? I'm fine. I can manage. I can afford that. But 600, 700 million people have no energy, zero electricity. When we increase the cost of energy, we are actually giving those people no chance at all to get energy. And some people will lose electricity. That means you're actually killing people, because if you don't have electricity, you die earlier. So energy policy at the fringe, at the poor people level, nobody talks about that. What does it mean we're increasing our cost of electricity? It's a huge problem for humanity. I mean, last year, no, 2021 was the first year in history, the past 4 decades, that the number of people without access to electricity didn't fall, but it rose by 20 million people. 20 million people, because of COVID, lost access to electricity. Who talks about that? 20 million people. And the more we increase the cost of our energy systems, the more people are going to be starved, they're going to be poor. And those are all elements you see in macroeconomic perspective. You cannot, when you focus on one element, but you leave out the other externalities, you are causing inefficiencies in the system. You're increasing the cost to the entire system, and you're actually causing distress and distortions you don't want. But nobody counts that. One example, simple example. Imagine we were to include methane into the greenhouse gas discussion. Imagine we were to. Suddenly LNG would be worse for the climate than coal. We would be better off burning coal than LNG if it was true that what the IPCC says and what the IEA says. We've written a paper on that. Very simple calculations. You just include methane. You don't even think about material, raw material input. Who's going to dig all the raw materials off? You don't think about those things. Just one element more, suddenly the whole world changes. But what are we doing? We're going from coal to LNG to save the climate. We're not going to save the climate. So there's all these macroeconomic things you have to start thinking about that are not discussed, but they're so important. And you know, we're trying to, okay, I'm going to have, you know, I don't know, 1 ton less of CO2, which of course makes 0 impact at all, right? We discussed that. But it doesn't, you know, focusing on the environment is hugely important. That's the one positive aspect of today's green agenda, that we are starting to think, yes, what we're doing has an impact on our world. And that impact is not good. But don't kid yourself, whatever we do has an impact on our world. Everything we do, everything comes from the ground somewhere, right? Who produces this, right? Where do they produce this? I mean, we can't continue kidding ourselves and trying to hurt. In the end, we're going to hurt and kill people, honestly. So that's sort of my macroeconomic view on this discussion on energy policy.
That is fascinating. It's fascinating. Okay, I'm now going to hand it over to Vlad, and perhaps he can give his view before we have a bit of a discussion and debate.
Okay.
Is it working? No?
Working? Yeah.
Okay. We have found one which works.
Okay. So I would like to try to go from another angle, because as the first panel was said, we are in the midst of war, and the European energy policy is not only about green agenda, it's also now about confronting the Russian aggression against Ukraine via sanctions and other methods. I would like to try to go a little bit in this direction, because I think the war will go on for another year at least. And the Europeans should elaborate a new energy strategy vis-a-vis Russia, because as also was mentioned, to be next winter with another portion of energy challenges. And so what I would like to point out, several very short points. First of all, because I'm a Russian living in America, so I can look on this issue from different angles. And I would say that I was very much surprised when the European Union announced its energy policy against Russian, sanction policy against Russian energy companies, starting with coal, then going to oil, then don't touching actually natural gas, which was the most important, I would say, dependency between Europe and Russia. And even in the 10th package of sanctions, we cannot see anything which was said about nuclear energy. Because, why was I surprised? Because from an economist's point of view, it was absolutely counterproductive, because if you want to punish the Russian government for its aggressive actions, you should start with those industries which benefit the government most. And nuclear energy is absolutely merged with the political elite in Russia. Its former chairman and former director of Rosatom, Kiriyenko, is now managing Putin's foreign policy and domestic policy as well. Then Gazprom is, of course, an energy weapon of Russia. And till these explosions on the Nord Stream 1 and 2, there were no European sanctions against Russian gas supplies. oil is much more diversified, and it's for around 50% in private hands, and it was sanctioned 1 year after the war started. And coal, which is 100% private in Russia, which doesn't belong to the state and which contributes almost zero to the federal budget, from where Putin gets money for the war, was sanctioned on the first place in August. What was it about? I don't know, because actually my point is that if you want to send a signal to Russia and to the Russian government via your energy policy and sanctions, you should send it that we are punishing the government, we are not punishing the business, because I would say in several years, Europe will still be dependent, as everybody says here, from fossil fuels, and Russia will still be a huge supplier of these fossil fuels. So some kind of cooperation, some ways of cooperation between Europe and Russia will still exist. And therefore, I would say in this case, you should pay much more attention to who is producing Russian energy. And not only what is the kind of the energy resource, but who is producing. Is it a private company engaged in international competition, or is a state-owned consortium like Gazprom? The second point was that, look, sometimes the war will be over. And in this case, even now there is debated an issue how Russia will pay, or will it pay at all, for the Ukrainian reconstruction. So the issue of reparations, I would say. And here there is another point, a very interesting point for me, because when I came for several conferences in Europe, in Germany, last April and last March, almost a year ago, everybody was talking about banning Russian oil and gas, saying that this will, deprive Putin of money, which is used for annihilating Ukrainian cities. My proposal was absolutely different. I say, look, it's a huge risk that you will deprive yourself of the energy resources, and the prices will go extremely high this year, which actually happened. My idea was that you should buy energy from Russia, but on much lower prices. And the price gap, I think, was a brilliant idea on Russian oil. But the second point of this strategy should be that if Europe buys, and it can buy, I think, the oil and gas from Russia under some kind of gaps, so it can be some surcharge levied on this, and it should be transformed into a solidarity tax for Ukraine. So you can buy gas from Russia, you can make it cheaper even than now, and then, for example, $100 for every 1,000 cubic meters, you can send to Ukraine as a solidarity tax. And this, it would be a way of turning Russian supplies for the sake of Europe and for sake of Ukraine. So anyway, I think that the strategy of European Union vis-a-vis Russia is absolutely contingent, because the sanctions, the pressure should be in place, and it should even be more forceful than now. But it should be something, it should be arranged in a way that helps both Europe and Ukraine. Because Europe will still be dependent on fossil fuels for around maybe 15, 20 years in the future. And Ukraine will need a huge amount of money for its restoration, which should be somehow extracted also from Russia. So just to finalize, I would say that, of course, the idea of green agenda, the idea of substituting, the fossil fuels with the renewables is, of course, a great idea. I don't share all the views which were expressed here about, that we should return to fossil fuels for the sake of efficiency. Yes, efficiency can be put on first place for several years, because of the war, because of the conflict, because of the short supply of energy resources. But nevertheless, it should be some kind of, I would say, merger of long-term strategy towards the greener economy and the greener energy, and towards, a new relationship between Europe and Russia, because Europe should get its energy from every possible source. And in the Russian case, it should be used not only for keeping the European economy running, but also for finding out additional sources for financial Ukrainian restoration after the war. Thank you.
Can I ask you a question, Vlad? What struck me, one of the things I've been looking at is in terms of what mechanism you could use. Is in relation to gas, it seems to be fairly straightforward. You know, there is all the gas which comes into Europe from Western Siberia, there are no pipelines to China, and frankly, with enough sanctions and power of Siberia too, which would provide such a connection, isn't likely to be built anytime soon. So they're kind of trapped. So one of my approaches was you could imagine a European regulatory structure whereby we said, well, there's a certain amount of gas which will be allowed into Europe. We will fix the price. We'll perhaps connect it to Henry Hub or something like that at a low price. There's a European Common Purchasing Authority which purchases the gas. They sell it to not disturb the European market and create distortions, that the purchasing authority will auction it onto European markets. And then they take the profit from that and they give it to Ukraine. Now, it seems to me that it stops Russia being able to flood back into the market later on. It stops any new dependency. It stops Russia having influence. And it gives Ukraine a serious revenue flow for rebuilding the country.
Definitely, I agree. This was my idea for many months because, look, for example, now, if I'm not mistaken, the price of natural gas on the European market is around $400 per 1,000 cubic meters or something like this. It was 3,000 when it was at the highest. But Russia for years supplies China with its natural gas on the average price of 220. So if the Europeans now, for example, imposes a price cap for Russian gas of 300, it was, I think, 1,000, proposed by the Commission, $300 per 1,000 cubic meters, the Russians will resume the supplies because they have no alternative. They have no another pipes via Turkey. They have not another pipes to China. Even the major pipe is not now fully used. It is used of around 60% of its capacity because they lack the deposits of gas on the way of the pipe. So therefore, different mechanism can be used. You can make an auction. You can make simply $200 surcharge and sell it to the European consumers for 500, sending the Ukrainians or creating a fund for the Ukrainian restoration and send it $200 for each supply. There are plenty of issues. Moreover, you can do the same with oil because it was brilliant idea to put the oil price cap. But now the oil price cap is 60 euros oil in Russia. Russian oil costs around 50. And everybody in the world buys it, the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Chinese, Singapore, but not Europe. Why? You can buy it by 60. You can sell it to your to chemical industry for 90. And once again, this difference can go to Ukraine. Why not? Why you combine the price cap with embargo? Price cap is by itself very, very efficient. Very efficient means. So there are a lot of problems which I cannot understand. The pressure on Putin should be intensified, but it should also bring some kind of benefits to the Europeans.
Exactly. Okay, I'm now going to open the floor. If anyone's got a question, just stick your hand up and give your name and give us your question. There's a gentleman over there.
Hi, David Abiyago, Argus Media. I write a lot about energy and commodities, and some of the things that you're suggesting, it seems like politically they would never have happened. And what you're saying now is we're looking back in time, and I mean, my impression is that things are going fairly decently. I mean, we're fighting a war. It's not costing too much. It's much cheaper than actually having troops there. We're doing things on the cheap, and the sanctions, the mechanism of, the unanimity, the fact that we're dealing with one member state that's, politically undermined. We see that in various little things happening in Hungary. We see Minsk. It just seems that what you're suggesting cannot actually come about. I mean, given our political system, which is a fairly decent political system in Europe, even if there is no one actor. So I just don't understand where, I mean, some of the things that you've said or I've heard said seem divisive. I mean, sorry, you mentioned the Greens. You know, I mean, emotionally, I think we've come a long way together. You know, that I respect Poles for what they've done. But when you say things that it seemed as if we're approaching the element that renewables or Greens are actually agents, and I just can't accept that. So my question is that by becoming quite, what's the word, political and divisive, that we're not about to change the way our decisions are made in terms of the energy, in terms of renewables, in terms of sanctions. So I don't see how we can get any further here.
So who do you want to address that to generally, or
Just
I understand properly because yes, you are right, and I'm not proposing this as a political agenda. I just wondering why it can be done, because of course, if there is a purely political principle, it can be done, and it will be done as it is going on these days. But it is quite costly to the Europeans, and it will be even more costly because as the war ends, Europe will definitely bear the greatest responsibility for the Ukrainian reconstruction. So therefore, anyway, if if after the war Russia will be facing some kind of reparations or whatsoever, it will be able to pay them only via a kind of compromise on this energy policy, because it, you know, the defeat of Russia in the Ukrainian war will not be like the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945. It would be just, you know, expulsion of the Russian forces from Ukraine, and that's it. And afterwards, if the West wants to get some money from Russia to Ukraine, it should be done through a series of compromises. So therefore, energy here should be seen as a major source and a major lever to get money from Russia for the common goals of Europeans. This is my point of view.
Just comment, politically, it won't fly. There's a will to deprive Russia of revenues, full stop, to win the war. So any relaxation will not politically be feasible, if rational. And it is not rational in a sense that reconstruction of Ukraine can be easily funded by confiscation of Russian assets. The Russian assets in the West are sufficient to, according to the figures produced by Kyiv, to pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine. It's much easier, much simpler. And as I said, no way political agreement can be to again start buying Russian energy. On the opposite, we are coming close to zero energy from Russia, and that should continue after Russian troops are out of Ukraine, because the nature of aggressive Russian politics, with Putin or without, even with Navalny as president, would remain the same. And we in Central Eastern Europe know it since 1,000 years. Thank you.
Thank you. And just coming back on the issue about being divisive and everything else, I think what I would say is that looking at the question of this question of critiquing the renewables, it's not really divisive, and I also don't think it's necessarily going to remain as it is, because we are clearly coming up against the walls of actual kind of economic capacity and economic reality. So I'll give you an example. The UK has been one of the leaders in wind power. We've got an enormous amount of wind power on the system already. We cannot take any more. The intermittency issues are just too difficult to deal with. And in fact, we're currently paying about £500 million sterling every year just to have power, to have wind power available, which we cannot use because of the intermittency on the system. So the difficulty is, as you move down the route of trying to use more and more renewables, and you cannot fix things. So you've got the intermittency issue. Unless you get super high battery storage, which currently doesn't exist, you have a problem with that. You've also got the other issue is that when you have renewables, you have immense distribution issues of power moving from place to place. So Germany, wind in the north, industry in the south. How do you get it from one place to another? You need to massively enhance your network because of the need to move the power and to deal with the intermittency issues. That is extremely difficult for Germany to do, not least because you get a whole range of environmental protests about building any of that power, those power lines. So you come up against a whole series of issues, which I think the argument here is not to say that we don't want to deal with the climate issues, but we actually have to have policies which work. And I don't think it's divisive. That is actually trying to get to the reality of the situation and actually find solutions which will work. And I think the problem is what we've got is I understand a lot of the aspirations and the commitment, but they have to be attuned to things which will actually work and can be executable. I think a lot of European energy policy is very strong on commitment and aspiration and less strong on implementation and capacity to execute. I think that is where I think a lot of this critique is made. Okay, so over here, Simon, who's written a very good book on hydrogen, which I recommend. So just
okay, thank you. But I will not speak about hydrogen. Before coming to a proposal for Ukraine, I think that we should not forget that we are dreaming with renewable energy.
Mm.
It's time to say the truth. I draft the directive of 2009.
Mhm.
So I was the pen for the directive of 2009. I know the topic. After having spent billions, 1,000 billions into year 2000, we reach 3% of our primary energy with wind and solar, 3%. All the other energies are refused by the Greens. All the other renewable energy are refused. So we have just left with wind and solar, which are 3% for the time being. So we will not go to 100, just physically impossible. And Mr. Chernikov has explained that also. No, what is the situation in Ukraine? Ukraine has zero renewable energy. Zero. But they have gas, coal, and nuclear energy. 4 months before the war, Ukraine signed contract with General Electric or Westinghouse.
I think it was G. I think it was G.
G?
I think it was G.
Okay. Signed with the American companies to build nuclear power plant. You know that they have a lot of nuclear power plant. And they will continue after the war to rely on nuclear energy. Why are we not going to develop bad energies, nuclear, coal, gas, and then import it to the EU? We will help them. We will help us also. And we should not forget that one of the first mistake in energy policy is to believe that everything is electricity. Electricity is 22% of the final demand. And so when you talk about wind and solar, you just discuss of possible increase of the 22%. What about the rest? The rest is what Ukrainians have. Coal, gas, nuclear energy, because we can produce hydrogen one day with that.
So I mean, actually, that's a very good point. I want to show one slide for Germany. Being German, can I do that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Because exactly, let me see if this works. Or should do slow. Excuse me. Hello, back there. Hello, the IT person. Can you hit that button there until you get to the right page? Because I cannot, doesn't work. Doesn't work. Okay. No, it's not working.
So I should just say in the meantime that one of our audience from Kiev says that it was actually Westinghouse and not GE. So just for that correction. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, the point is the following. Germany as an example. Germany has doubled its installed power capacity for producing electricity, which by the way is 40% of primary energy. Why? Because it's 20, the 20% is used then with efficiency loss to make electricity. So forget that, it's not going to get there. Are we going to get there? No, we're not. Germany has doubled its installed capacity, entirely built up wind and solar, doubled its installed power capacity, doubled, okay? From 120 gigawatt to 240 gigawatt roughly. With that doubling, they have now achieved a 30% share of electricity, 30% share of electricity, which equals about 10% of primary energy, having spent 1 trillion of taxpayers' money. Now, the base load capacity, which is basically nuclear, coal, and gas of electricity. Nuclear is going to be turned off in a couple of months. Coal is going to be turned off in 8 years. And gas, of course, we'll see what we do with that. So the base load capacity is now reaching a level where we are running short of electricity. That means we're going to have to turn off power consumption, right? So when at night there's no sun, not even in Germany, okay, not even in Dubai, right? And wind, there is 1996 was a year where we had 8 weeks, 10 weeks of practically no wind and solar in entire Europe. So what we call Dunkelflaute, where there's no wind and no sun for a long period of time, right? So these things you have to start. That's why wind and solar will never, ever work. Purely energy economically. It's not a political question. Purely energy economically. On top of that, we don't have any storage. We don't have it. Batteries will work for a couple of days. A couple of days will not help me. I need weeks. Hydrogen, here's the man. Ask him about the efficiency of hydrogen, right? And what it requires to make hydrogen, because hydrogen doesn't come from the ground. It could come from the ground, it's very expensive. So we have zero long-term storage in Europe. So how can energy policy, when I say zero, I should never say zero, but practically inefficient. Okay. So how can we have, especially in a time of war, have our energy policy all about wind and solar? It doesn't work. Let me give you one more example. Steel production. We want to make everything electric. Electric cars, we don't discuss it today. Electric steel, perfect. Electric steel. The chairman for ThyssenKrupp said last year, by the way, when my company ThyssenKrupp will be carbon neutral in 2030 in 7 years. Okay, fine. By the way, don't forget, my electricity consumption will 10 times increase going to electric. For the same steel production, he will now need 10 times more energy than he needed before, being produced by the least efficient way of producing energy, which is solar and wind. So you start to see the folly of what's happening here. If Europe continues to do this, I mean, China is laughing, Russia is laughing, the US is partially laughing, but the US is going in similar ways, by the way. I've been there several times and they have many, many issues. I mean, it's incredible. We are deindustrializing. We are going to have blackouts. Of course, electric cars are not going to be charged when we don't have power. I mean, for me, it's difficult to understand how politicians don't see that. Why are we doing all this? Why are we doing all this? To save the climate, right? Mm-hmm. Right? Because because the world of climate change is so bad that will be the end of the world. Well, maybe we have another end of the world issue to deal with in Europe. Yeah? It's not going to be that bad, of course. We'll all be fine. But you get the point. I mean, I'm being a bit more on the top, right? A bit more specific, but you get the point. By going wind and solar, we are running into energy starvation. And it's not a political question. It's not being against green. It's not against climate policy. It's purely energy economics.
You mentioned steel. I think ArcelorMittal closed a plant in Spain. I think it was not too long ago because of energy costs. I'm not sure where it was.
Yeah, I'm going to take one more question and then I'm going to stop. We have some problems with these.
Right, I'll shout. In fact, it's Dr. Ryan that made a comment about there's a problem moving electricity north from the north of the UK to the south and north Germany to South Germany, and it's a third comment. Gentlemen over there make this point. Why do we keep talking about just electricity? Why don't we talk about gas? And a couple of years back, we were doing a power to gas study for Hitachi's attack. And I was speaking to Ito Power, which they eventually took over. And Ito Power, as some of you may know, had a power to gas project in North Germany. And as the guy said to me, you know, Germany doesn't have a north-south energy problem. It has a north-south electricity problem, but it doesn't have a north-south energy problem. All the gas pipelines are there. And Dr. Schernickau said, oh, you know, we haven't got any storage. Well, Germany has 220 terawatt hours of gas in its system right now. Right now.
Wind and solar. We wasn't talking about gas.
Yeah, but the point is that the assertion was there's no storage. And that's the problem, that if you just look at the energy system in terms of electricity without other vectors, then sure, there's a bit of a problem. There is. In the case of the UK, the gas pipelines from Aberdeen follow the 400 kV double circuit lines that run south. There's a wonderful place where I could build a huge set of wind farms, and I could plug straight into the high pressure gas network. I wouldn't have a problem shifting the energy. It wouldn't be electricity, it'd be gas. And I suggest that perhaps we need to, you know, broaden our views a little bit.
Where do you get the silver from for the solar panels? Where do you get the silver from?
They're moving to other metals.
Look, I work in commodities, okay?
Yeah.
That's my main job. And I see where we are extracting these commodities, and I see how they're processed, how they're shipped to China, used with coal-fired power, and then put back here. Who is talking about commodities here? Who is talking about raw materials? The raw material input per ton of per megawatt hour on the outside. Have you ever seen a study on this? I'm trying to get funding for that. Just calculate the tons of raw materials per megawatt hour producer of electricity or power, doesn't of energy, but nobody counts that. And by the way, for solar, you will not be able to do that with solar because you won't have enough silver.
Yeah, but you're assuming that silver is the only option, in the same way that you make frankly speaking, a category error, assuming that the 90 megatons or 110 megatons of primary steel is always got to be 90 or 110 megatons in Europe per year. But I've got studies that show that if we really got hot and heavy recycling steel through electric arc furnaces, you could reduce that to about
Tell that the
40
Bangladeshis and the
megatons.
Pakistanis, tell that Bangladesh and Pakistan, 200 million each. Tell that Nigeria, tell that Ethiopia. I'm sorry, we're not relevant.
Okay.
World problem. We're not talking about a European.
Okay. If there are no further questions, I think we can call it a day. I'm going to thank the panel in the usual fashion. That was a really great, interesting, wide-ranging discussion. Thank you very much. And I think there's some coffee and sandwiches, and please participate and talk energy a little further. Thank you very much.